This video is sponsored by Summoner's War, the world's top mobile turn-based RPG currently on Google Play and the App Store, now with over 110 million downloads combined. And right now it's going through its first ever collaboration event. A crossover with Street Fighter V to bring us popular characters like Ryu, Ken, M. Bison, Chun-Li, and Dhalsim. Not only that, but Summoner's War is always being updated with brand new in-game features and collectible characters, of which there's now over 1,000 unique monsters to collect and awaken. It's a massive roster that makes it so that no battle will ever be the same. And with it comes a whole lot of versatility behind the creation and customization of various team compositions and strategies. So much so that the appeal of the global PvP has led Summoner's War to become one of the most successful mobile esports games out there. So if you're interested in checking out this Street Fighter V collaboration event, then go ahead and use the link in the description to download Summoner's War for free today. There's plenty of in-game events and even an augmented reality filter available on social media. So be sure to download Summoner's War with the description below and summon your free Ken now. Now, let's get into the video. With such an exposition-heavy and eventful episode like this one, I'm sure quite a few of you were left with at least a couple of questions. I mean, Satella's arrival wasn't entirely explained, and neither was the whole situation revolving around her appearance. This was a very crucial plot point that goes to justify both Satella and Garfiel's behavior. There was also quite a bit more information given to Echidna's experiments, specifically with regards to the history behind it. So let's take a closer look at all this plus more as we go through what this episode left out from the novels. Let's begin. Episode 35, I Know Hell, covering chapters 1 to 3 of volume 12 of the light novel. To explain everything from the beginning, let's first go back a little bit to the end of episode 34, back to when the shadow first started to shroud Subaru's existence. The place it was taking him was one that he was very much familiar with. It was the very same world he'd been brought to whenever he'd broken the taboo. But this time it was completely different. Rather than being filled with despair, he was instead being smothered by some form of affection. Subaru couldn't move, he couldn't think. At some point he even forgot how to breathe. That's just how captivated he was by this shadow. It filled every part of his being with a feeling of love and adoration that he couldn't resist. There was so much passion overwhelming his mind, body, and soul that it wouldn't even be incorrect to call this something akin to an assault or violation of love. It was effectively draining any and every bit of love that Subaru had for others. Well, at least that's how he felt anyway. But this wasn't something the witch was doing without any sort of purpose. Her goal was never just to take Subaru's love for herself. No. She also wanted to place him into a vulnerable state so that she could search his mind for everything he cared about. Her true intentions were to find and understand that which Subaru truly loved. That way she would be able to rid the world of those distractions and completely monopolize his affection. This was always Satella's goal. It's why she abruptly decided to head for the barrier after Garfield had taken Subaru away from her. She was heading to the mansion to fulfill the task that she set out to do: eliminate the competition. Now, despite knowing that this loop was already a dead end, Subaru couldn't help but still feel the urge to want to stop her. So he went and asked Garfield if he could somehow slow her down. But Garfield already knew from numerous attempts before that that was pointless. Every attack he tried just got absorbed by the witch's shadowy veil. It was likely that her dark dress had the special ability to nullify all physical attacks. This meant that magic was the only viable option, making Roswaal the best candidate to fight the enemy in front of them. But since Ryuzu's house had already been engulfed by the shadows, relying on Roswaal wasn't really a possibility anymore. Really, the only thing left that Subaru could do was despair. As he thought long and hard about any other options, that's when he came to a key realization that was cut from the anime. A realization that helps to justify Subaru and Garfield's plan of action. You see, Subaru remembered that the witch was technically a silver-haired half-elf, just like Emilia. If that was in fact the case, then she shouldn't be able to exit the barrier without completing the trial. Such was the nature of Sanctuary. Plus, it's not like this shadowy figure was just the manifestation of Satella's vestigial mind either. Garfield was able to confirm with absolute certainty that the witch in front of them had a physical body. So if she was to have any sort of weakness, then that was definitely what it was. It was this fact that served as the foundation for Garfield and Subaru's plan. If Satella was to pass through the barrier and somehow be weakened by its effects, then that was the opportunity that they could use to attack her. And if Garfiel's claws could somehow make it past her shadowy veil while she was distracted, then Subaru was sure that even the Witch of Envy wouldn't come out unscathed. That's just how much raw power Garfiel's tiger form had. So Garfiel and Subaru circled the witch from the treetops, scouting to find the exact point at which she would arrive at the barrier. Once they figured it out, the only thing they needed to do was get there then set up a distraction. Initially, Subaru volunteered to be that distraction, but Garfiel refused to risk sacrificing another person. It was pretty weird to see Garfiel be so impacted by the sadness of loss when just in the previous loop he was able to slaughter all the villagers. I mean, with the way that Garfiel was acting right now, Subaru couldn't understand what it was that led him to take such drastic action in that situation. But now really wasn't the time to think about it. No, that's because Subaru had found himself standing right in front of the point where Satella would reach the barrier. This was the place that him and Garfiel chose to fight their decisive battle. All that was left now was to simply wait for Satella to arrive. As they waited, that's when the clones of Ryuzu finally made their appearance. You see, Garfiel's idea of a counterattack was something more along the lines of an onslaught of numbers. They would wait for Satella to cross the barrier, then charge with everything they've got. Once that moment came, there were two important things excluded that I think need to be mentioned. The first was an out-of-character statement made by Garfiel right before he charged in to attack. He basically took a brief moment to apologize in advance for something. As for what exactly it was that he was apologizing for, well, Subaru wasn't quite sure. The second thing was that Garfiel had somehow nullified the effects of the barrier, allowing him to engage Satella from outside its boundaries. We don't know exactly how he did it, but his soul remained in his body as he attempted to fight Satella with every ounce of his being. That said, the only attacks that seemed to do damage was the explosions from the clones. Surprisingly, they actually worked to disperse the shadows that covered the world. One by one, they exploded and opened up a path for Garfiel to strike. But that single strike he was able to make wasn't enough to do anything. Although Garfiel's claw looked as if it had made it past Satella's Shroud of Darkness, it didn't seem to matter since in the next moment he was gone, leaving only Subaru with the terrifying entity in front of him. After she engulfed his entire being, what Subaru became was an amalgamation of his body, mind, and soul. He could no longer make the distinction between one or the other. Everything was just becoming one jumbled entity, slowly dissolving into everything that had been swallowed by the shadow before him. It was here in this brief instance of becoming what was pretty much a collective consciousness that Subaru became exposed to the emotions of many others. He was able to experience feelings and witness memories of the previous victims, all of which became deeply ingrained into his mind, body, and soul. Now, had Echidna not left Subaru with some insurance, then this would have become his permanent end. Luckily, that insurance created a light that restored Subaru's consciousness. A bright light in the pitch black that brought Subaru back to his senses long enough for him to realize what it is he needed to do. Upon waking up, Subaru's memory of the witch's face brought forth a significant fear towards the girl lying in front of him. He was only able to build the confidence to wake her up after assuming Satella's appearance to be nothing more than a trick, a form that she chose to appear as in order to appeal to Subaru. This train of thought eventually brought him to a realization about the events prior to his awakening that wasn't fully explained. It was more something that you'd have to piece together on your own. What this realization was that Satella had manifested in Sanctuary then proceeded to take possession of Emilia's body. This was the conclusion that Subaru had come to. To him, if an Archbishop of Sin could do it, then a witch definitely could as well. If that was in fact what happened, then it would also go to explain the reasoning behind a lot of Garfiel's actions. His restrained demeanor towards Subaru was because he had failed to protect Emilia. His absolute certainty in the witch having a physical body was because he knew that Emilia had been possessed. His apology in advance was because he knew that he'd have to strike down this Emilia turned witch right in front of Subaru's eyes. All this pointed to the fact that Emilia had been taken from him. But this conclusion wasn't just merely to make sense of what happened. It was also the justification Subaru needed so that he could work up the courage to confront Emilia. The thing is, Subaru's fear of Satella transcended beyond reality. Her authority over time made him wonder if she would eventually just disregard his ability to return by death and simply take action herself. What scared Subaru the most was the possibility that Satella could go back in time herself and change whatever she wanted. He wasn't sure if she was even capable, but the fact that it was even plausible is what terrified him to the core. All this doubt and fear followed him as he finally used whatever little courage he had left to wake up Emilia. He knew that he would have to comfort her from the nightmare that she just experienced, but the fear still had a very strong grip over his body. Only after hearing her voice call out his name did that grip start to loosen, leaving him completely speechless. Despite still trying to figure out the best way to console her, Emilia beat him to it by completely disregarding her own problems to focus on his. Her gentle touch and the warmth of her body led Subaru to break down into tears like how we saw in the anime. But he wasn't crying out of grief or mental anguish. His tears stemmed from the relief that came with knowing that Emilia was still Emilia. An overwhelming sense of comfort filled his body as he could now confirm that the witch had not stolen Emilia away from him. So, the only way that Subaru knew how to express this emotion was through the waterfall of tears that was flowing from his eyes. Anyway, we already know how Subaru found this loop to be going better than any of them before. So that means that we can skip ahead to his conversation with Ram. Although it didn't seem like it, there was actually quite a bit of depth to Ram's statement regarding how Subaru looks at her. She understood that it wasn't something of carnal desire, but instead something vaguer. At first, Subaru didn't quite understand what she meant, but eventually he realized that she was implying that he never actually looks at her. Instead, he was always looking past her, as if every time he gazed in her direction it wasn't Ram that he would see. No, what he would see was a completely different person. This was something that Subaru had been trying to avoid, but I guess he subconsciously couldn't help himself from visualizing Ram in Ram. In any case, this whole conversation made Subaru feel a little bit unsettled. But what made him feel even worse was the slight hint of gloom that could be seen on Ram's face. Although her concern was very subtle, the gentle nature she shared with her sister was apparent now more than ever. This made Subaru want to tell Ram all about Ram, but his memory of Ram willingly wanting to sacrifice Ram made him hold his tongue. Instead, he just went on to ask his favor. As their discussion continued, both seemed to notice something very telling about the other just from the look in their eyes. Ram's displayed a certain benevolence that seemed to contradict the way that she spoke about Garfield. Subaru didn't want to assume anything, but there was no denying the gentle look in her eyes that came whenever she spoke of him. Subaru, on the other hand, had eyes that showed something a bit more grim. Ram could tell that whatever it was Subaru saw in the tomb, it wasn't good. Compared to the gaze that he always had while looking past her, this was something far more unpleasant. It led to a standoff of interlocked stares that eventually resulted in Ram agreeing to help. Bringing us now to Subaru's encounter with Ryuzu Bilma. Her reveal of the clones finally made sense of how it was that Subaru's previous escape plan had been foiled. The Ryuzus spread throughout Sanctuary had definitely reported his movements to Garfield. Other than that, the Q&A from the anime gave us a streamlined version of the backstory with regards to Ryuzu Meyer and her clones, something that the novel goes into a little bit more. One thing to note before getting into the nature of their being was that there was actually a very particular disdain that Subaru gained from knowing that one of his acquaintances was a fake. Don't get me wrong, he knew he had no right to judge the circumstances of someone who lived in a fundamentally different world, but the concept of clones and imitations wasn't something that he could very easily accept. So Ryuzu then went on to give more context behind how exactly their existences came to be. An easy way of putting it is to consider the odd they spoke of as their soul. You see, odd refers to the power or life energy that exists within every living being from birth, basically making it the opposite of mana and the equivalent of a soul, or as Ryuzu likes to put it, the proof of a soul. To have odd means to have life itself. So because Ryuzu and the clones have this artificially manufactured odd, it's pretty much the same as saying that they have an artificial soul. One that was then wrapped in mana and given physical form, much like how Puck creates his own. Now, the actual purpose of these clones was initially explained to be a resurrection experiment intended to bring the original Ryuzu Meyer back to life. Or, to put it more accurately, resurrect her soul. This made Subaru believe that Echidna's experiments birthed out of her desire to revive the life of someone that was close to her. But that was far too naive a perception. I mean, yes, Ryuzu Meyer was an irreplaceable person to Echidna, just not in the way that Subaru would like to imagine. The original Ryuzu Meyer was nothing more than a village girl who couldn't even be called Echidna's acquaintance. It would be a lot more accurate to say that Ryuzu's importance was something that manifested out of Echidna's greed. Her greed for knowledge that made her pursue the possibility of immortality, something that Subaru possessed yet Echidna was never able to acquire. It is, however, very significant to note the fact that she tried. I mean, it's quite normal for someone to fear death and want to do everything they can to avoid it. But Echidna actually had the means to make it happen. Such was the nature of a witch. Only an existence like hers could actually come up with a viable method of preparing for what comes after life. So knowing this made Subaru feel the closest he'd ever been to Echidna. It was apparent now more than ever that she truly was the only person who could understand what he was going through. And for that, he was truly grateful. As for why the experiment didn't work, well, that simply boiled down to lack of space. Ryuzu's empty vessel didn't have enough capacity to house Echidna's entire soul. The reason this results in failure is because if trying to fill the vessel eventually leads it to overflow, then the portions that spill out result in the creation of an inherently different person. Someone who couldn't be called Echidna. And to her, that was a complete failure. So, given that a failed Ryuzu did in fact exist, Subaru wanted to know what happened to it. He believed that even though Echidna's entire soul may not have been passed over, surely it must have inherited at least something. But the way Ryuzu responded implied that what came from this experiment was a creation far beyond Echidna's expectations. You see, she wasn't able to pick and choose what transferred and what didn't. There was no controlling what portion of her memories and what portion of her personality would be sent over, both of which, if incomplete, are considered beyond saving. In this case, the failure inherited some of Echidna's power but no personality to speak of, which incidentally made for quite a bit of trouble. So, the only choice Echidna had when faced with this partial version of her was to dispose of it. But that didn't stop her from continuing the experiments. She felt that if capacity was the issue, then perhaps the volume of the soul being passed on could be modified. Kind of like compressing the amount of data that needs to be transferred. Here's the thing though, we don't know if this method ever worked or not. Echidna never got the chance to try it. She was consumed by the Witch of Envy before getting the opportunity to do so. So she could very well still have the key to immortality within her reach, just no means of implementing it. Moving on to the business of Subaru being an apostle, this was basically the rank bestowed upon him by Echidna. But Ryuzu liked to refer to it as being one of Echidna's pawns, a statement that Subaru didn't take very kindly. Now, one last thing to point out here was the significance of the shields in the background. Supposedly these were toys that Garfield and Frederica used to play with when they were younger. So it's not like their relationship with each other has always been as strained as it is now. There was a time when they did get along. In any case, not much needs to be said with regards to the scenes with Emilia or Otto. Instead, we can now skip ahead to Subaru's encounter with Garfield. There was a very unsettling feeling that came with the timing of Garfield's decision to confront Subaru, bringing him to the very crucial question of why now? Subaru had three potential answers for Garfield's sudden change in behavior. The first was the miasma emitting from his body, but that wouldn't explain why he didn't act the day before. The second was that he was spotted trying to leave Sanctuary, but that would imply that Subaru was being tailed the entire time, something Garfield couldn't admit to. So the third and final assumption then brings the first two together, and it relates back to the very first clone that Subaru met. But before Subaru could finish his sentence, that's when Garfield started to get really angry. Now, in the novels they don't explicitly state what exactly it was that Subaru was going to say here. All we know is that he was about to call Garfield something that made Garfield back off while inducing both a sense of disgust and a slight sense of fear. Whatever it was most definitely related to whatever secret Garfield was keeping. A secret that Subaru was determined to resolve. It was this seemingly bottomless determination that now gave Subaru the upper hand. Although the words he spoke were very confusing to Garfield, they somehow hammered in the fact that killing him now wouldn't change a thing. It was a gamble that Subaru was willing to take in order to understand the piece of the puzzle that was Garfield. Even if Garfield decided to kill him now, Subaru saw no problem with replicating this entire loop as it was. He was actually very confident in his ability to do so. So all in all, it was this confidence and determination that ultimately got Garfield to back off, leading us now to the final moments at the mansion. Considering that technically only a single day had passed since Subaru left for Sanctuary, Frederica was a little bit tense with regards to the situation. She was still trying to feign ignorance on the true nature of Sanctuary, a secret she couldn't reveal due to her pact. But that was yet another thing that Subaru vowed to expose along with Garfield's secrets. After Subaru had explained the plan of hiding in the village, Frederica couldn't quite refute his request since only a week ago Subaru was also correct about the attack from the witch cult. His reasoning was that it was a precaution that needed to be taken in the case of the witch cult remnants deciding to strike again, not because of Elsa. Then, after Petra had run off to take care of things in the mansion, there was actually quite the lengthy conversation that took place between Frederica and Subaru, one that pertains to her and Garfield's past. But I have a very strong feeling that this will likely be covered in a later episode, so I'll probably save it for next time. But yeah, that's pretty much everything you need to know about Season 2, Episode 10. Just like with the others, I hope this video helped to show a few extra things about the ReZero story. And if you enjoyed watching it, then be sure to leave a like or comment. Also be sure to subscribe so that you'll know right away when episode 11 comes out. But until then, ciao!